pregnant mistress thought she'd won the marriage, until the ex-wife revealed the truth. Night had settled quietly over Dallas. From the balcony windows of the mansion, the city stretched out in glowing lines of gold and white. Cars slid through the highways like slow-moving stars. Music from a rooftop lounge somewhere downtown drifted faintly through the warm Texas air. Inside the house, the silence felt expensive, the kind of silence only large homes seem to hold. Clara walked slowly across the marble floor of the kitchen, her heels clicking softly with each step. The house lights reflected across the polished counters, making everything look almost too perfect. For a moment, she simply stood there, taking it all in. The tall ceilings, the clean lines of the architecture, the view of Dallas beyond the glass walls. Her hand moved gently over her stomach. 3 months. She had already started imagining the future. The nursery upstairs, morning sunlight filling the bedrooms, dinner parties where people admired the life she had finally stepped into. Clara slid her fingers across the smooth marble countertop, like someone claiming a prize. A quiet smile appeared on her face. "I always knew this house would come back to me." She said it softly, not like a celebration, more like a prediction finally proving itself right. Clara had walked through this house before, years earlier, back when she was still married to Alexander, back when the rooms held arguments instead of dreams. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like correction, like life had finally returned what she believed was hers. She turned slightly, glancing across the open space of the dining room. Alexander sat at the table, his chair pushed slightly back, his elbows resting on the wood, a phone in his hand. He hadn't moved for several minutes. At first, Clara assumed he was reading business emails. That was normal for Alexander. Deals never seemed to stop following him. But something about the way he was sitting made her pause. He wasn't typing, he wasn't talking, he was just staring. Clara watched him for another few seconds, waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to smile. After all, this was supposed to be a new beginning. The divorce had been finalized. The future she believed in was finally opening up. Yet Alexander looked like someone sitting in a hospital waiting room. Clara stepped closer. Her heels echoed lightly through the room until she stopped beside the table. She leaned slightly toward him. "Why do you look like someone died?" Alexander didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the phone screen. Then slowly, he lifted his head. The look in his face stopped Clara's smile from growing any wider. There was no excitement there, no relief, just a quiet emptiness. His voice, when it came, sounded flat. "Because something just did." Clara frowned slightly. "What are you talking about?" Alexander didn't explain. Instead, he turned the phone toward her. The screen filled with a legal document, property ownership transfer confirmation. Clara leaned closer, scanning the words. Her eyes moved down the page until they reached the line that mattered. Owner, Bianca Holdings LLC. For a moment her brain refused to process what she was reading. Her smile slowly disappeared. Alexander's voice broke the silence. "The house," he swallowed once, "was never mine." The room felt suddenly colder. Clara stared at the screen again, then slowly lifted her eyes toward him. A quiet question slipped out before she could stop it. "Then whose life?" Her voice faltered. "Did I just destroy?" If you've ever watched someone chase the wrong prize until it cost them everything, take a moment and press like on this video. And I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Clara knew exactly what she was doing? Or did she simply underestimate the wrong woman? Because this story isn't really about betrayal. It's about patience. And patience can be the most dangerous weapon in the room. If you're new here, we're glad to have you. Subscribe and join us for more inspiring stories that motivate, uplift, and open the mind. And before the story begins, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you're watching from? And what city are you in? Because tonight's story begins in a city that knows a lot about ambition, a city where success looks beautiful from the outside, but the truth behind it can change lives overnight. Dallas, Texas, 3 years earlier. 3 years earlier, Dallas looked just as beautiful from a distance. The skyline glittered every night like the city had something to prove. Tall buildings caught the sunset and held onto it just a little longer than the neighborhoods below. Expensive restaurants stayed busy long after midnight. rooftop lounges filled with people raising glasses to success stories that sounded polished enough to believe. But Dallas had always been good at presentation. If you stayed long enough, you discovered that every shining tower had quiet stories hidden beneath it. And one of those stories began with a woman named Bianca. Bianca had just turned 32 that year. Most people assumed she was younger, not because she tried to appear youthful, but because she carried herself with a calm energy that made people curious. Tall, dark-skinned, with warm brown eyes that noticed details most people missed, Bianca had the kind of presence that didn't need attention to command it. Her natural curls framed her face softly, and she dressed the way she lived, simple, confident, and deliberate. Nothing about Bianca was accidental. She had grown up in South Dallas, not the version of Dallas visitors photographed from hotel windows, the real neighborhoods, the ones filled with early Sunday mornings where church bells mixed with gospel music drifting through open doors, the smell of barbecue smoke hanging in the air on summer afternoons, children racing bicycles down cracked sidewalks while their parents called them back before the streetlights came on. In Bianca's childhood home, Sunday dinners were sacred. The kitchen was always alive with movement, pots simmering on the stove, sweet potato pie cooling on the counter, loud conversations bouncing between relatives who loved each other enough to speak honestly. Her grandmother sat at the center of most of those conversations, a woman whose voice carried the calm authority of someone who had watched life long enough to understand people better than they understood themselves. One evening when Bianca was younger, she had asked her grandmother a question that stayed with her for years. "Grandma, how do you know when someone is telling the truth?" Her grandmother didn't answer immediately. She wiped her hands on a towel, leaned back in her chair, and studied Bianca carefully. Then she said something that would become one of the most important lessons Bianca ever learned. "Baby, people always show you who they are." She paused before continuing. Most folks just don't want to pay attention long enough to see it. Bianca never forgot that sentence. She carried it with her through every stage of her life, especially when she began building her career. After graduating from the University of Texas, Bianca stepped into the world of financial consulting. Not the glamorous version that television shows like to portray. The real work involved long hours reviewing contracts, studying investment structures, and sitting through strategy meetings where patience mattered more than personality. But Bianca had a natural instinct for numbers. More importantly, she understood something many investors missed. Money was rarely about speed. It was about discipline. That mindset helped her quietly build a reputation among small business owners and property developers who needed someone they could trust with complex financial decisions. Restaurants, real estate partnerships, startup ventures that looked risky on the surface but made sense when examined closely. Bianca listened carefully before advising anyone. She studied patterns. She paid attention. And slowly, the results started to appear. Investments began growing. Partnerships expanded. Properties followed. By the time Bianca entered her early 30s, she had built something many people spent decades chasing: stability. Her life felt balanced. Weekdays were filled with work that challenged her mind. Weekends still belonged to the culture she grew up loving. Friday nights meant music, laughter, and crowded lounges where people danced like the world owed them joy. Sunday afternoons meant family dinners where stories lasted longer than the food. Her friends often joked that Bianca lived in two different worlds comfortably. She could attend a luxury gala, wearing heels and a tailored dress, then show up the next day at a backyard cookout, laughing with everyone over ribs and sweet tea. And through it all, Bianca held on to the lesson her grandmother taught her: watch people closely, because the truth always reveals itself eventually. She believed that lesson would protect her. For a long time, it did. But the funny thing about life is this: sometimes the moment that changes everything looks ordinary at first. And for Bianca, that moment began on a warm evening inside a quiet rooftop lounge overlooking downtown Dallas. The night she met Alexander, long before Bianca ever stood inside that Dallas mansion, long before lawyers and divorce papers and hidden bank records changed everything. Her life had been shaped by a very different kind of environment. South Dallas raised people with sharp instincts. The neighborhood did not hide reality behind luxury. It was a place where life happened out in the open. You saw who people really were, because there was very little space to pretend. Bianca's childhood home sat on a quiet street where the evenings carried familiar sounds: children laughing somewhere down the block, a car radio playing old soul music, the smell of charcoal grills drifting across the neighborhood as families cooked dinner outdoors. Her grandmother believed routines created strong people. Every Sunday morning started the same way: pressing clothes for church, music humming softly from the kitchen, a long wooden table waiting to be filled with family members who arrived carrying stories from the week. Bianca grew up listening more than she spoke. Her grandmother had a habit of watching people carefully while they talked, not interrupting, not judging, just observing with a patience that made others eventually reveal more than they intended. One afternoon when Bianca was about 16, she noticed her grandmother studying two relatives who were arguing quietly near the porch steps. Bianca leaned closer. "You already know who's right, don't you?" she asked. Her grandmother smiled slightly without looking away from the scene. "I know who's being honest." "How?" Her grandmother finally turned toward her. "Because people always tell the truth eventually." She tapped the side of her temple. "You just have to be patient enough to see it." That idea stayed with Bianca long after she left home. Years later, when she attended the University of Texas, she discovered that the same principle applied to more than just people. It applied to money. Most students in the business program chased quick wins. They talked about fast investments, big risks, and the thrill of striking it rich early. Bianca rarely joined those conversations. She preferred studying how money moved over time. Patterns interested her more than excitement. While others rushed toward the newest opportunity, Bianca looked for stability. She studied how businesses survived difficult seasons, how property values changed across decades, how quiet investments slowly outperformed flashy ones. By the time she graduated, she already understood something many professionals spent years learning the hard way: wealth favored patience. Her first job in financial consulting was not glamorous. The office sat in a plain building downtown. No luxury lobby, no impressive skyline view, just a small team reviewing contracts and advising local businesses that needed careful financial planning. The work required long hours. Some nights Bianca stayed late studying investment documents long after most employees had gone home, but those quiet hours became her advantage. She began noticing details others missed: a restaurant owner struggling with debt but sitting on valuable property, a small development project overlooked by bigger investors, a business partnership structured poorly but capable of producing strong returns with a few adjustments. Instead of chasing recognition, Bianca built relationships slowly. Business owners appreciated her honesty. She did not promise miracles. She explained risks clearly. She recommended patience when others pushed for aggressive moves. That approach earned trust. Within a few years, Bianca was advising multiple businesses across Dallas: restaurants, small real estate projects, startup partnerships. The money she earned was good, but what mattered more was what she did with it. She invested quietly: a share in a property here, a partnership in a development there. Small steps, consistent steps. By the time she turned 30, Bianca owned more assets than most people realized. But if you met her at a weekend gathering, you would never guess it. She still attended family cookouts in South Dallas, wearing simple summer dresses and laughing with cousins who teased her about working too much. She still helped her grandmother carry groceries inside the house every Sunday afternoon. Success had not changed her routine. It had simply expanded her options. Her friends often joked that Bianca lived two completely different lives. During the week, she attended meetings with investors and reviewed complex financial reports. On weekends, she danced with friends at crowded lounges where the music was loud and nobody cared what you did for a living. Bianca liked that balance. It reminded her where she came from. It reminded her not to become impressed by appearances, because her grandmother's lessons still lived quietly in her mind. Watch people long enough, and they reveal themselves. For a long time, Bianca believed that patience would protect her from being misled. Then one evening, after finishing a long day reviewing contracts, a friend called her with a suggestion. "Come out tonight," the friend said. "You work too much." Bianca laughed. "I have meetings early tomorrow." "Just one drink," the friend insisted. "There's a rooftop lounge downtown with an amazing view of the city." Bianca hesitated for a moment. The idea of fresh air and music sounded tempting after hours of staring at financial documents. Finally, she agreed. "All right. One drink." Later that night, Bianca stepped onto the rooftop overlooking downtown Dallas. The city lights stretched across the horizon. Soft music floated through the air. People talked quietly around small tables while the warm breeze moved through the space. Bianca walked toward the railing, resting her hands lightly against the metal as she looked out over the skyline. She didn't know it yet, but that simple decision, to accept one invitation, was about to change the direction of 3 lives forever, because somewhere behind her, only a few steps away, Alexander had just noticed her standing there. The rooftop lounge floated several stories above downtown Dallas, high enough that the noise of the streets softened into a distant hum. Soft music moved through hidden speakers. Glasses clinked occasionally. A warm breeze carried the faint scent of citrus and perfume across the terrace. Bianca leaned against the railing quietly, letting the wind move through her curls. After a long day reviewing contracts, her mind finally felt still. She enjoyed moments like this. Simple pauses where nothing demanded her attention. Behind her, conversations drifted across the space in fragments. A group of people discussing real estate near the bar, someone laughing loudly near the entrance, servers walking carefully between tables balancing trays of drinks. Bianca wasn't paying much attention to any of it. She was watching the city. Dallas at night had a certain confidence about it. The lights felt alive, like every building had its own story unfolding behind the windows. That was when she felt it. Not a sound, not a voice, just the subtle awareness that someone nearby had noticed her. Bianca turned slightly. A man stood several feet away, speaking with someone near the edge of the terrace. Tall, broad shoulders, a dark suit that fit well without looking overly styled. His hair carried streaks of gray that gave him a composed, experienced look. Early 40s, perhaps. But what caught Bianca's attention wasn't the way he looked. It was the way he observed people while talking. Most people in places like this scanned the room constantly, searching for someone more important to speak with. This man did the opposite. When he spoke to someone, he focused fully on them, listening, watching, evaluating. The conversation he was having ended a moment later. The man thanked the other guest politely before stepping away. Instead of returning to the crowded part of the lounge, he walked toward the railing, toward Bianca. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Do you mind if I stand here?" he asked. Bianca glanced briefly at the empty space beside her. "It's a big city," she said lightly. "I think we can share the railing." A small smile crossed his face. "I'm Alexander." Bianca. He rested his hands against the railing beside hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They both looked out toward the skyline. Alexander broke the silence first. "Dallas looks different from up here." Bianca nodded slightly. "Everything does." "How so?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. "When you're on the ground, everything feels loud. Fast. Competitive." She gestured gently toward the buildings. "But from up here it just looks organized." Alexander studied her with quiet curiosity. "Organized?" "Like pieces on a board," Bianca said, "everyone moving around trying to get somewhere." Alexander laughed softly. "That might be the most strategic description of a city I've ever heard." "What can I say?" Bianca replied. "I work with numbers all day. Everything starts looking like patterns." Alexander turned slightly toward her. "What kind of work?" "Financial consulting." He raised an eyebrow with interest. "That explains the pattern comment." Bianca glanced at him. "And what do you do, Alexander?" "Real estate mostly." "Mostly?" "A few other investments," he said casually. Bianca noticed something about the way he answered. Not vague, just controlled. Like someone who had learned to reveal information in careful portions. She respected that. People who spoke too freely about money usually didn't understand it. Alexander leaned back slightly against the railing. "Most people I meet in finance talk about profit like it's a competition," he said. Bianca shrugged. "That's usually the mistake." "What do you mean?" "Money isn't a race." Alexander studied her expression. "Then what is it?" "A test of patience." The answer came so calmly that Alexander paused. "Patience? Most people lose money because they're impatient," Bianca explained. "They chase excitement instead of stability." Alexander smiled thoughtfully. "That sounds like advice someone learns the hard way." "Sometimes," Bianca said. "Sometimes people are lucky enough to learn it early." Alexander looked out at the skyline again. You're different from the people I usually meet at places like this." Bianca laughed lightly. "Is that a compliment or an observation?" "Both." They continued talking. The conversation moved easily from business to city life to the strange social circles that existed inside Dallas. Alexander told stories about development projects. Bianca offered insights that occasionally surprised him. More than once, he looked at her with genuine interest, not because she was trying to impress him, but because she clearly understood the world he lived in. Eventually, the music shifted and the crowd began thinning. Alexander glanced at his watch before looking back at Bianca. "I'm glad I came over to introduce myself." Bianca smiled. "So am I." He hesitated briefly before speaking again. "I'd like to see you again." Bianca didn't answer immediately. She had met successful men before. Many of them carried complicated lives, but something about Alexander felt different from the usual personalities she encountered in wealthy circles. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't trying to impress her. He seemed thoughtful. After a moment, she nodded. "All right." Alexander's expression relaxed. "Dinner sometime next week?" "That works." They exchanged numbers. Then Alexander stepped back slightly. "I'll call you." Bianca watched him walk toward the elevator with the same composed confidence he had carried all evening. For a few seconds she remained at the railing, looking out at the city again. She felt calm, curious about what might happen next, but completely unaware of one very important detail. Bianca had just agreed to date a man whose life was far more complicated than he had allowed her to see, because somewhere else in Dallas, there was already another woman connected to Alexander's world, a woman named Clara, and Bianca had just stepped quietly into the center of a story she didn't even know existed yet. Alexander called Bianca 2 days after the rooftop meeting. The call came in the early evening while Bianca was finishing work at her office. She glanced at the number briefly before answering. "Hello?" "Bianca, it's Alexander." His voice carried the same calm confidence she remembered. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd forgotten about that dinner invitation." Bianca leaned back in her chair with a small smile. "I said I'd think about it." "And what did the thinking lead to?" She closed the document on her computer. "It led to curiosity." Alexander chuckled softly. "That sounds promising." "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere quiet." "Quiet usually means expensive." "Not always," he said. "Sometimes it just means private." Bianca agreed to meet him the following evening. The restaurant Alexander chose sat in one of Dallas's more discreet neighborhoods. From the outside, it looked simple. No large signs, no loud crowds gathered at the entrance. Inside, the lighting was warm, and the atmosphere relaxed. Conversations stayed low and unhurried. Bianca appreciated that immediately. Alexander stood when she arrived. "You look even more confident than you did on the rooftop." Bianca slid into the chair across from him. "Confidence is easier when you're not balancing on heels." Alexander smiled. Dinner moved easily. They talked about business, travel, and the strange personalities that filled wealthy circles in major cities. Alexander told stories about property deals that involved months of negotiation. Bianca shared insights about financial planning that surprised him. At one point, he leaned back slightly, studying her. "You know something interesting about you?" "What's that?" Bianca asked. "You never sound impressed by money." She shrugged. "Money is useful." "That's it?" "That's it." Alexander laughed. "Most people treat it like a trophy." "That's because most people don't understand how quickly trophies can disappear." Alexander's expression grew thoughtful. "Who taught you that?" "My grandmother." "What did she do?" "She paid attention to people," Bianca replied, "long enough to see who they really were." Alexander seemed to respect that answer. After dinner, he walked her to her car. "I enjoyed tonight," he said. "So did I." They stood there for a moment, under the soft glow of the parking lights. Alexander spoke again. "I'd like to see you again." Bianca nodded. "I figured you might." The next few months unfolded naturally. Dinner became a regular habit, sometimes at restaurants like the first one, other times in places Bianca had never visited before. Private clubs, small art galleries, business events where conversations revolved around investment opportunities and development projects. Alexander moved through those environments comfortably. People greeted him with familiarity. They asked about deals. They discussed upcoming ventures. Bianca noticed something about him in those settings. He rarely dominated the conversation. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, people paid attention. That kind of respect wasn't accidental. It meant Alexander had influence. But Bianca also noticed something else. There were parts of his life he rarely discussed. Family, home, personal history. Whenever those topics approached the conversation, Alexander shifted smoothly to something else. At first, Bianca didn't question it. Everyone carried private chapters they preferred not to share too quickly. Still, her instincts quietly registered the absence. One evening they sat together at a private lounge overlooking the city. The room was nearly empty. Alexander seemed more relaxed than usual. "You're unusually quiet tonight," Bianca said. "I've been thinking." "About what?" Alexander looked out the window before answering. "Life gets complicated when you build too many responsibilities." Bianca waited. Finally he continued, "My marriage hasn't been working for a long time." Bianca remained still. "I didn't know you were married," she said calmly. Alexander nodded slowly. "Technically, I still am." The words hung in the air. "But it's been over for years," he added quickly. "We just haven't finalized things yet." Bianca studied his face, not accusing, just measuring. "And you're telling me this now because I respect you," Alexander said, "and I don't want you hearing it from someone else." Bianca leaned back slightly in her chair. Her grandmother's voice echoed somewhere in her memory. "People always show you who they are. You just have to pay attention long enough to see it." Alexander continued speaking. "We barely talk anymore. We live separate lives. The divorce paperwork is already being prepared." Bianca listened quietly. His explanation sounded reasonable. His tone sounded sincere. Still, something about the situation felt unfinished. But Bianca believed something important about people. If you watched long enough, the truth revealed itself. So instead of pushing further, she simply nodded. "All right." Alexander seemed relieved. Their relationship continued. Dinners turned into weekends together. Weekends turned into longer conversations about the future. And from the outside, everything looked natural. But somewhere across the city, another woman had begun noticing the changes in Alexander's life. A woman who had once shared his home. A woman who understood his habits better than anyone. Her name was Clara. And one evening, as Bianca and Alexander left a private event together, Clara sat quietly inside a parked car across the street, watching, not angry, not emotional, just patient, because Clara believed something with absolute certainty. No matter how interesting Bianca appeared, Alexander's life would always circle back to her eventually. She was just waiting for the right moment. And that moment was closer than anyone realized. By early autumn, Bianca had grown used to the quiet rhythm of Alexander's world. The invitations, the private dinners, the polished social events where conversations about business and investments flowed as easily as the wine. Most of the time, Bianca attended those gatherings with quiet curiosity rather than excitement. She had never chased elite circles, but she understood how they operated. Money had its own communities, and Alexander moved through those communities with the confidence of someone who had been part of them for years. One evening, he invited her to a charity fundraiser held in one of Dallas's historic ballrooms. "This one matters," he said while adjusting his cufflinks before they left the house. "Do I need to prepare a speech?" Bianca asked with a teasing smile. Alexander laughed. "No speeches, just appearances." Bianca nodded. "Appearances are usually more complicated than speeches." Alexander didn't argue with that. The ballroom glowed under soft golden lighting. Tall glass chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting warm reflections across polished floors. Round tables filled the room, each decorated with carefully arranged flowers and small candles that flickered gently. Guests moved through the space with practiced ease. Some stood in small groups discussing projects. Others greeted each other with the quiet familiarity of people who had attended many of these events before. Bianca walked beside Alexander calmly. Her emerald dress complemented her dark skin beautifully. Her curls rested naturally around her shoulders, and she carried herself with the same composed confidence she brought into every room. Alexander leaned closer as they entered. "You look incredible tonight." Bianca smiled lightly. "I always do." Alexander chuckled. That confidence had become one of the things he admired most about her. She never seemed overwhelmed by these environments. She simply moved through them. They greeted several people near the entrance. Alexander shook hands, exchanged short conversations. Bianca listened more than she spoke, but something unusual began to happen as they moved deeper into the room. People were looking at them, not casually, carefully. A few conversations paused when they passed. Bianca noticed the subtle shifts immediately. She leaned closer to Alexander while pretending to study the room. Why does it feel like everyone here knows something I don't? Alexander's expression tightened briefly before he forced a relaxed smile. Curiosity travels fast in this city. That wasn't my question, Bianca said quietly. Alexander didn't respond. Instead, he guided her toward the bar where a server offered them drinks. The event continued smoothly. A speech about community programs, a silent auction display, polite applause, but Bianca couldn't shake the feeling that the room was quietly observing them. Then, something changed. A subtle shift in attention moved across the ballroom. Bianca noticed several people glance toward the entrance. Alexander followed their gaze. His posture stiffened. Bianca turned. A woman had just walked into the room. She carried herself with effortless confidence. Blonde hair styled neatly, an elegant black dress that matched the tone of the event perfectly. But what stood out most wasn't her appearance. It was the calm authority in her expression. She scanned the room once, then her eyes landed on Alexander, and stayed there. Bianca felt the tension instantly. The woman began walking toward them. Alexander straightened slightly. "Bianca," he said quietly. "Yes? There's someone I need to introduce you to." Bianca studied his face. He rarely sounded uncertain. That alone told her everything she needed to know. The woman reached them. Her smile was polite. Controlled Alexander. The way she said his name carried history, years of it. Alexander cleared his throat. "Bianca, this is Clara." Bianca felt the pieces fall into place immediately. So this was the woman he had mentioned, his wife, or soon-to-be former wife. Clara turned her attention to Bianca. Her smile remained calm. "Nice to finally meet you." Bianca held her gaze without hesitation. "Nice to meet you too." There was a short pause, the kind of silence where people nearby pretend not to listen while hearing every word. Clara looked Bianca over carefully, not rudely, just thoughtfully. "You seem lovely," Clara said. Bianca nodded slightly. "And you seem calm." Clara's smile widened, just a little. "That comes with experience." Alexander shifted uncomfortably. "Clara, maybe this isn't the best place for—" But Clara lifted her hand gently. "Oh, relax," she said lightly. "I'm not here to cause a scene." Her eyes moved back to Bianca. "You should enjoy the evening." Bianca noticed something in Clara's tone. Not hostility, not jealousy, something else. Confidence. As if Clara understood something about the situation that Bianca had not yet discovered. Clara stepped back, then turned and walked calmly across the ballroom. The moment she disappeared into the crowd, the surrounding conversation slowly resumed, but Bianca remained still for a few seconds, processing. She finally looked at Alexander. "You didn't tell me she would be here." "I didn't expect her to be," Alexander replied. Bianca watched Clara from across the room. Clara had joined another group of guests, speaking casually as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet something about her presence lingered in Bianca's mind. Not anger, not fear, just a quiet sense that this story was more complicated than Alexander had described. Bianca turned back toward him. "Your marriage seems less finished than you suggested." Alexander exhaled slowly. "It's complicated." Bianca nodded. "Life usually is." Across the room, Clara glanced briefly in their direction again. Her expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. Then she looked away and continued her conversation. But before she left the ballroom later that night, Clara passed Bianca once more. She paused just long enough to say one final sentence. "Experience teaches patience." Then she walked away, leaving Bianca standing there, wondering exactly what that meant. The drive home from the charity gala felt quieter than the evening itself. Alexander kept his attention on the road as the city lights slid across the windshield. Traffic moved steadily through downtown Dallas, headlights stretching into long streams along the highway. Bianca sat beside him, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She wasn't angry. She wasn't emotional. But she was thinking. Clara's presence at the event had shifted something in the air. not dramatically, just enough to make Bianca feel that there were details she still didn't understand. After several minutes of silence, she spoke. "So, that was your wife?" Alexander nodded. "Yes." Bianca turned slightly toward him. "You didn't seem surprised to see her." Alexander hesitated before answering. "In this city, you eventually run into everyone." "That's not what I meant." Alexander sighed quietly. "I know." They drove another block before he continued. "Clara and I have been separated for a long time." Bianca listened without interrupting. "Our marriage stopped working years ago," Alexander said. "We stayed legally connected longer than we should have." "Why?" Bianca asked. Alexander kept his eyes on the road. "Business partnerships, property structures. It's complicated to untangle things when two lives have been connected that long." Bianca considered that explanation. Financial structures could become complicated when people built wealth together. She understood that better than most. "So the divorce is happening?" she asked. Alexander nodded. "The paperwork has already started." Bianca watched his expression carefully. He sounded confident, but something about the situation still felt unfinished. Not wrong, just incomplete. She leaned back against the seat. "All right." Alexander glanced toward her briefly. "You don't sound convinced." "I'm listening," Bianca replied calmly. "That's all." Alexander didn't push the conversation further. The rest of the drive passed quietly, but from that night forward, the subject of the divorce slowly became more real. Over the next several weeks, Alexander mentioned meetings with lawyers, discussions about property agreements, documents being reviewed. Bianca didn't ask for details every time. She simply observed. Months passed. Dallas moved through its seasons. Autumn faded into winter. And slowly the story Alexander had described began to reach its conclusion. One afternoon, he called Bianca while she was leaving her office. "It's done," he said. "What's done?" "The divorce." Bianca paused beside her car in the parking garage. "Officially?" "Yes." His voice carried relief. "The papers were finalized this morning." Bianca absorbed the news quietly. "Well," she said after a moment, "that must feel like closing a chapter." Alexander exhaled. "It does." From that day forward, their relationship no longer carried the same quiet tension it had before. Alexander and Bianca began appearing together more openly in social spaces, restaurants, private gatherings, business events. The whispers that had followed them earlier slowly faded, and over time, something else began growing between them. Not just attraction, comfort, the kind of familiarity that develops when two people spend enough time learning each other's habits. One evening several months later, Alexander invited Bianca to his house for dinner. The property sat in one of the quieter neighborhoods outside downtown Dallas. Tall iron gates opened onto a long driveway that curved toward the house. Bianca had visited before, but tonight felt slightly different. Alexander seemed unusually thoughtful throughout the evening. After dinner, he led her outside onto the balcony overlooking the city. Night had settled over Dallas again. Lights stretched across the skyline in quiet patterns. Bianca rested her arms on the balcony railing. "You've been acting mysterious all evening," she said. Alexander stood beside her. "I've been thinking about the future." Bianca turned slightly toward him. "That sounds serious." Alexander reached into his jacket pocket. Then he looked directly at her. "I don't want you to feel like you're just another chapter in my life." Bianca raised an eyebrow. "What exactly am I supposed to feel like?" He opened his hand. A small ring rested in his palm. "I want to build something real with you." Bianca stared at the ring for a moment, not shocked, just thoughtful. "Alexander, I know life with me isn't simple," he continued, "but I've never met anyone who understands my world the way you do." He paused before finishing the sentence. "Marry me." For a few seconds, Bianca didn't answer. She looked out across the city again, thought about the months they had spent together, the conversations, the trust that had slowly formed between them. Finally, she looked back at him. "You're sure this isn't just another transition in your life?" Alexander shook his head. "No." Bianca studied his face carefully. Then, she nodded once. "Yes." Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger. For a moment, they both stood there quietly, looking out across the glowing city. From the outside, it looked like a perfect moment. Two people beginning a future together. But life has a way of hiding complicated truths behind beautiful scenes, because sometimes The biggest lies arrive wrapped inside the happiest moments, and somewhere else in Dallas, Clara was quietly preparing to step back into Alexander's life again. For a while, life between Bianca and Alexander felt steady, the kind of calm that follows after a complicated chapter finally closes. The divorce was finished. The tension that once hovered around their relationship had disappeared. Alexander and Bianca moved through Dallas openly now. Dinner reservations no longer required careful planning. Business events felt easier. The whispers that had once followed them slowly faded. From the outside, everything looked settled. But life rarely stays settled when pride and unfinished emotions are involved. And Clara had never been the kind of woman who simply disappeared from a story. At first, Alexander only noticed small reminders of her, an occasional message, a short phone call about paperwork that still needed final signatures. Nothing unusual. After all, they had shared years of their lives together. Loose ends were expected. One evening, Clara called while Alexander was sitting alone in his office. Her voice sounded calm. "I found one of the documents the attorney mentioned." Alexander leaned back in his chair. "Which one?" "The property statement from last year." Alexander rubbed his forehead. "You can just send it to the lawyer." "I will," Clara replied. There was a short pause. Then she added something softer. "You sound tired." Alexander glanced at the clock. "I've had a long week." Clara didn't respond immediately. Finally, she said, "We used to talk about things like that." Alexander shifted slightly in his chair. "That was a long time ago." Clara laughed quietly. "Was it?" The conversation ended shortly after, but the call stayed in Alexander's mind longer than he expected. Not because he missed Clara. At least, that's what he told himself. It was simply familiarity. Two people who had once known each other well, nothing more. Weeks later, they met for coffee to finalize a final piece of paperwork. The meeting was brief, professional. They spoke politely while reviewing the document, but something about the moment felt strangely comfortable, like stepping back into a place that had once been familiar. As Clara stood to leave, she paused. "You look different," she said. Alexander frowned slightly. "How?" "Relaxed." "That tends to happen after a divorce." Clara smiled. "Maybe." Then she left. Alexander didn't think much about the meeting afterward. But a few weeks later, Clara called again. This time, there was no paperwork involved. "I'm near your neighborhood," she said casually. "I thought we could talk." Alexander hesitated. Still, curiosity made him agree. They met at a quiet restaurant not far from his house. The conversation started with harmless topics: work, Dallas traffic, the strange way life seemed to move quickly after major changes. But the longer they talked, the easier the conversation became. They remembered shared experiences, old trips, private jokes that had once belonged only to them. For a moment, it felt like stepping into a memory. Alexander reminded himself that it meant nothing, just two people reflecting on a chapter that had ended. Still, when Clara suggested meeting again another evening, he didn't refuse. Over the next few months, those meetings continued. Not often, just enough to keep the connection alive. Dinner occasionally, coffee sometimes. Alexander told himself it was harmless. After all, he was already engaged to Bianca. His future was clear. But emotions rarely follow the logic people try to impose on them. Clara understood that better than anyone. She never pushed too hard, never demanded attention. Instead, she allowed familiarity to grow slowly again. Comfort, conversation, moments that felt easier than Alexander expected. And with every meeting, Clara observed something carefully. Alexander still carried pride in his success, his reputation, the powerful life he believed he had built. Clara knew how important those things were to him. She also knew how easily pride could guide someone into making foolish decisions. One evening, Clara arrived at his house unexpectedly. Alexander opened the door with surprise. "Clara?" She stood calmly on the porch. "I needed to talk to you." Alexander stepped aside, allowing her to enter. "What's going on?" Clara walked slowly into the living room. Her expression looked different tonight. Not playful, not nostalgic, serious. Alexander waited. Finally, she turned toward him. "I didn't plan this," she said quietly. Alexander felt a sudden tension in his chest. "What do you mean?" Clara placed her hand gently on her stomach. The gesture alone made Alexander's mind race ahead of her words, but she said them anyway. I'm pregnant. The room fell completely silent. Alexander stared at her. You're serious? Clara nodded once. 3 months. Alexander ran his hand through his hair, trying to process what he had just heard. This complicates everything. Clara tilted her head slightly. Does it? Alexander looked at her in disbelief. Of course it does. Clara didn't raise her voice. She simply watched him, calm, certain, because in her mind, the situation was already moving exactly where she wanted it to go. And somewhere across the city, Bianca had no idea that the foundation of her future had just begun to shift again. The moment Clara spoke the words, the air inside Alexander's living room seemed to stop moving. I'm pregnant. Alexander remained standing near the center of the room, staring at her as if his mind needed extra time to catch up with what he had just heard. Clara didn't rush to fill the silence. She stood calmly, her hands resting lightly in front of her, watching his reaction with careful attention. Alexander finally spoke. You're serious? Clara nodded. Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Alexander turned away for a moment, walking toward the large windows that overlooked the quiet Dallas street outside. Cars passed occasionally beneath the glow of the street lights. 3 months. The number echoed in his mind. 3 months meant the timeline was already complicated. His engagement to Bianca, the final months of the divorce, the meetings he had convinced himself, meant nothing. Alexander rubbed his forehead slowly. This changes things. Clara tilted her head slightly. I expected you to say that. Alexander turned back toward her. You didn't tell me earlier. I just found out recently, Clara replied. Her tone remained steady. I wanted to be sure first. Alexander took a deep breath. A child had always been something he imagined eventually, just not like this. And certainly not now. He looked at Clara again. What do you want from me? Clara held his gaze. I'm not asking for anything tonight. That answer surprised him. I thought you'd be angry. Clara shook her head. Anger wouldn't solve anything. She placed her hand lightly over her stomach. This situation already exists. Alexander remained silent, because he knew she was right. The situation was real, and the consequences were already beginning. Across the city, Bianca had no idea that the foundation of her relationship had just cracked. 2 days later, Alexander sat inside the kitchen of the mansion he shared with Bianca. Morning sunlight spilled across the marble counters. Bianca stood near the stove, pouring coffee into 2 cups. She noticed immediately that Alexander had been unusually quiet since waking up. You look like someone who didn't sleep, she said calmly. Alexander rubbed the back of his neck. Long night. Bianca handed him a cup. Work? Alexander hesitated. The silence lasted long enough for Bianca to notice. She leaned lightly against the counter. Something you want to tell me? Alexander stared down at the coffee for several seconds. Then he spoke. I ran into Clara again. Bianca didn't react immediately. All right. Alexander continued. She came by the house a few nights ago. Bianca studied his expression. And Alexander took a breath before finishing the sentence. She's pregnant. The words settled heavily in the kitchen. Bianca stood still. No shouting, no dramatic reaction, just quiet attention. Alexander watched her carefully, waiting for the anger that usually followed news like that. But Bianca's voice remained calm. How far along? 3 months. Bianca nodded slowly. She placed her coffee cup on the counter. Then she asked the only question that mattered. Is the baby yours? Alexander didn't attempt to avoid it. Yes. Bianca closed her eyes briefly, not in shock, more like someone acknowledging a fact that had finally become impossible to ignore. When she opened her eyes again, her voice carried a soft disappointment rather than rage. I see. Alexander stepped closer. Bianca, listen. It happened during a confusing time. Clara and I were reconnecting and... Bianca raised her hand gently. That explanation isn't necessary. Alexander stopped speaking. She walked slowly toward the window, looking outside at the quiet neighborhood. The moment felt strangely calm. Too calm. Alexander expected accusations, arguments, anything that sounded emotional. But Bianca simply stood there thinking. Finally, she spoke again. You know what's interesting about betrayal? Alexander frowned. What? The person doing it usually believes they're in control of the situation. Alexander felt uncomfortable with the way she said that. What does that mean? Bianca turned back toward him. Her expression wasn't angry, just thoughtful. It means people often underestimate the consequences of their decisions. Alexander shook his head. You're acting like this is some kind of strategy game. Bianca's voice remained steady. No, she looked directly at him. I'm acting like someone who just received new information. Alexander stepped closer again. Bianca, this doesn't have to destroy everything. Bianca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied his face carefully. The same way she studied business deals before deciding whether they were worth trusting. Something inside her had shifted, not loudly, not emotionally, but permanently, because the moment Alexander admitted the truth, Bianca understood something important. The story she thought she was living had just changed. And from this point forward, every decision would matter. She picked up her coffee again, then said quietly, "Thank you for telling me." Alexander blinked. That's it? Bianca nodded. For now, but inside her mind, a new process had already begun, one that would quietly reshape the future for all three of them. Clara had always believed that life rewarded bold decisions. Some people waited for opportunities, others created them, and, in Clara's mind, the pregnancy had just secured the opportunity she had been waiting for. The news had changed everything. At least, that was how she saw it. In the weeks after telling Alexander, Clara moved through Dallas with a quiet confidence that hadn't been visible in her before. Her posture seemed straighter. Her voice carried a new certainty. And when she rested her hand over the small curve beginning to form beneath her dresses, she felt something close to victory. Alexander had always talked about wanting a family one day. Now that future had suddenly arrived, and Clara believed she was the woman standing at the center of it. One afternoon, she sat in a small cafe not far from downtown, the kind of place where professionals stopped during the middle of the day for coffee and short conversations. Clara sat near the window, sunlight falling softly across the table. Her phone rested beside her cup as she scrolled through messages from acquaintances who had begun noticing the news. Dallas social circles had a way of spreading information quickly, not loudly, just quietly enough that everyone eventually knew. Clara read the messages with a faint smile. She knew exactly what people were thinking. The story looked simple from the outside. Alexander had divorced Bianca. Now his former wife was expecting his child. In Clara's mind, the outcome of that situation was obvious. Eventually, Alexander would return to her. Eventually, the life she once lived inside his house would belong to her again. She imagined walking through those familiar rooms once more. The marble kitchen, the wide living room windows, the balcony overlooking the city. Except this time, she would not just be the wife. She would be the mother of his child, the woman who secured his legacy. The thought made her smile again. Later that week, she visited a boutique downtown. As she browsed through clothing racks, she caught her reflection in one of the mirrors. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, still small, but visible enough that she could see the beginning of the change. A quiet pride filled her chest. Clara had always believed motherhood carried power. It created a bond that no other relationship could compete with, and in her mind, that bond would eventually guide Alexander back toward her. Meanwhile, Bianca continued living her life in the mansion with the same calm routine she had always maintained. On the surface, nothing about her behavior seemed different. She attended meetings, reviewed investment documents, spent evenings reading or working quietly in her home office. But behind that calm routine, Bianca had begun examining something carefully: information, specifically the structure of Alexander's business world. One evening, she sat alone at the large desk inside her office. Her laptop screen displayed several financial records, company registrations, property ownership documents, investment structures tied to Alexander's ventures. Bianca studied the information patiently, not searching for revenge, just clarity. She had always believed something simple: if your life becomes connected to another person's future, you should understand exactly how that future is built. Alexander often spoke confidently about the businesses he managed, the investments he oversaw, the wealth he had accumulated through years of real estate development. But Bianca understood that confidence and ownership were not always the same thing. As she continued reviewing the records, certain patterns began to appear: legal structures, partnership arrangements, holding companies connected to specific properties. Some of the documents surprised her, not because they showed anything dishonest, but because they revealed something interesting about how Alexander's world was organized. Bianca leaned back in her chair, thinking quietly. Across the city, Clara continued imagining the life she believed she had secured. That evening, she met Alexander for dinner. The restaurant was quiet, dim lighting, soft music playing somewhere in the background. Clara spoke easily throughout the meal, about baby names, about future plans, about the kind of home she imagined raising a child in. Alexander listened, though his expression seemed more thoughtful than excited. "You don't look happy," Clara finally said. Alexander shook his head. "It's not that." "Then what is it?" He paused before answering. "This situation is complicated." Clara leaned forward slightly. "Why?" Alexander hesitated. "Because Bianca is still part of my life." Clara's smile returned. "That won't last forever." Alexander looked up at her. "What makes you so sure?" Clara held his gaze calmly. "Because eventually, people follow what matters most." Her hand moved gently across her stomach again. "And this matters." Alexander didn't respond, because deep down he knew Clara might be right about one thing. The pregnancy had changed everything. But what Clara didn't understand yet was that Bianca had already started learning the full structure of the world she believed she was about to inherit. And when the truth behind that structure finally surfaced, Clara's confidence would disappear faster than she could imagine. The silence inside the house had changed, not dramatically, just enough that Alexander noticed it. Bianca still moved through her daily routines with the same calm rhythm she had always maintained. She woke early, handled her work calls, reviewed financial documents, and spent evenings either reading or sitting quietly on the balcony. But the conversations between them had grown shorter, more careful. Alexander sensed the distance, though he couldn't fully explain it. One evening, he returned home later than usual. The house was quiet, except for the soft music playing from the living room speakers. Bianca sat on the couch with a tablet resting on her lap. She looked up when he walked in. "You're home late," she said calmly. "Meeting ran longer than expected," Alexander replied. Bianca nodded. She didn't ask what kind of meeting. That alone made Alexander uneasy. He sat down across from her. "We need to talk about what's happening." Bianca placed the tablet on the table beside her. "Yes," she said, "we probably do." Alexander leaned forward. "I know things have been tense since I told you about Clara." Bianca remained quiet. "I don't want this situation to destroy what we have," he continued. Bianca studied his face for a moment. Then she asked a simple question. "What exactly do you think we have right now?" Alexander frowned. "A future." Bianca tilted her head slightly. "A future built on what?" Alexander hesitated. The question sounded simple, but the answer felt complicated. Finally he said, "We've built something real together." Bianca nodded slowly. "Yes, we did." Her voice held no bitterness, just acknowledgement. Alexander relaxed slightly, believing the conversation might move toward reconciliation. But Bianca continued speaking. "Alexander, a child changes things." Alexander rubbed his hands together. "I know, and that child deserves stability," Bianca added. He nodded again. "That's exactly what I've been thinking." Bianca looked at him carefully. "I'm glad." Alexander waited for her to continue. She folded her hands calmly in front of her. "I think we should get a divorce." The sentence landed quietly in the room. Alexander blinked. "What?" Bianca repeated it with the same calm tone. "A divorce makes the most sense." Alexander stared at her in disbelief. "You're serious?" "Yes." Alexander stood up, pacing a few steps across the living room. "This isn't like you." Bianca watched him calmly. "How so?" "You don't walk away from things easily." Bianca smiled faintly. "That depends on what the thing is." Alexander turned toward her again. "You're giving up too quickly." Bianca shook her head gently. "This isn't giving up." "Then what is it?" She answered without hesitation. "It's making a clear decision." Alexander ran his hands through his hair. "Bianca, listen. The pregnancy complicates things, but it doesn't mean we have to end everything." Bianca's voice remained steady. "It means your priorities have changed." Alexander didn't respond because part of him knew she was right. Bianca continued, "A child should grow up in an environment without confusion." Alexander sighed. I didn't expect you to react like this. Bianca leaned back slightly in her chair. Most people react emotionally. And you're not emotional? Bianca gave a small smile. I'm practical. Alexander stared at her for a moment, trying to understand what she was thinking, but Bianca's calm expression revealed nothing. Finally, he asked quietly, You're really willing to end our marriage like this? Bianca nodded once. Yes. The conversation ended, not long after. Alexander left the room with a mixture of frustration and confusion. From his perspective, Bianca had simply accepted the situation. Across the city, Clara received the news 2 days later. Alexander told her during dinner. Bianca suggested divorce, he said. Clara paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. She did? Yes. Clara leaned back in her chair slowly. A smile spread across her face before she could stop it. Well, she said softly, that solves a lot of problems. Alexander frowned slightly. You sound happy about it. Clara met his eyes. Wouldn't you be? Alexander didn't answer. Because even though Bianca had suggested the divorce, something about the situation still didn't feel as simple as Clara believed. Meanwhile, Bianca continued sitting quietly in her home office that same evening. Her laptop screen displayed a series of financial documents, ownership structures, property records, business registrations. She studied them carefully, not with anger, not with revenge in mind, just with the patience she had practiced her entire life. Because Bianca understood something neither Alexander nor Clara realized yet, the story wasn't ending. It was only moving into its final chapter, and Bianca wasn't stepping aside. She was stepping back, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. The mansion felt different the first day Clara returned, not because the house had changed. The marble floors still reflected the afternoon light the same way they always had. The tall windows still framed the quiet Dallas streets beyond the property gates. But Clara walked through the front door with a different mindset than she had before. This time, she wasn't visiting. At least, that was how she saw it. Alexander opened the door and stepped aside to let her enter. Clara moved slowly across the living room, taking in the familiar space. The furniture, the artwork on the walls, the soft lighting that made the house feel both elegant and comfortable. Her hand rested lightly over her stomach again. The pregnancy had begun to show slightly now, just enough that she could feel the shift in how people looked at her. She turned toward Alexander. You kept everything the same. Alexander shrugged. I didn't see a reason to change it. Clara walked toward the large windows overlooking the backyard. This place always had beautiful light in the afternoon. Alexander leaned casually against the kitchen counter. He looked more relaxed than he had in weeks. For the first time since the pregnancy revelation, his life seemed to be moving toward a clear direction again. Bianca had suggested the divorce herself. There had been no dramatic fights, no legal battles, just a quiet agreement that their marriage had reached its conclusion. Clara turned back toward him. I've been thinking about the guest room upstairs. Alexander raised an eyebrow. What about it? Clara smiled. It would make a perfect nursery. Alexander looked up the staircase briefly. I suppose it could. Clara began walking slowly through the house again. The kitchen, the dining room, the living room. Each space seemed to fill her imagination with plans. I can already picture the furniture, she said casually. A crib near the window. Alexander listened quietly. Soft colors, Clara continued. Something calm. Alexander nodded. That sounds nice. Clara's voice carried an excitement that had grown stronger over the past few weeks. She spoke about baby names, about future birthdays, about the life she imagined raising a child inside this house. And the more she spoke, the more natural the future began to feel. Alexander watched her thoughtfully. Part of him felt relief. The uncertainty that followed the pregnancy revelation had slowly settled into a new routine. Clara was calm, confident, certain about the path ahead, and Bianca had not fought the divorce. From Alexander's perspective, the situation had resolved itself. Life was simply moving forward. Clara stepped onto the back patio for a moment, breathing in the warm evening air. She looked out across the quiet yard. For the first time in a long time, she felt secure. The child growing inside her would connect her to Alexander forever, no matter what had happened between them before. She believed that bond would reshape everything. When she walked back inside, Alexander was pouring 2 glasses of water. "You look happy," he said. Clara accepted the glass. "I am." Alexander leaned against the counter. "I didn't expect things to settle this easily." Clara took a slow sip before answering. "Life usually finds its balance." Alexander smiled faintly. "Let's hope so." But somewhere across the city, Bianca was sitting inside her office reviewing a final set of documents. Her expression remained calm, unbothered. While Clara imagined the future inside the mansion, Bianca was quietly confirming the details of a structure she had built years earlier, one that neither Alexander nor Clara had ever fully understood. And when that structure finally revealed itself, the future Clara was imagining inside that house would disappear faster than she could imagine. The divorce hearing took place on a quiet weekday morning. There were no crowds, no reporters, no dramatic confrontation between former partners. Just a calm courtroom where the process unfolded with the same steady pace used for hundreds of similar cases every year. Bianca arrived early. She wore a simple dark dress and carried a small folder containing the final paperwork. Her expression remained relaxed. If anyone in the hallway had looked closely, they would have seen a woman who appeared completely at peace with the moment. Alexander arrived shortly afterward. He greeted Bianca with a polite nod. "Good morning." "Good morning," Bianca replied. The exchange felt strangely normal. 2 people who had once shared a home, now sitting quietly across from each other while their marriage officially ended. The judge reviewed the documents carefully. Legal language filled the room as the agreements were confirmed. Property arrangements, financial terms, final declarations. Bianca listened calmly while the details were summarized. Nothing in the process surprised her. She had reviewed every document weeks earlier. Alexander sat quietly beside his attorney, occasionally glancing toward Bianca. He expected tension, bitterness, some sign that the moment carried emotional weight, but Bianca remained composed. When the judge finally looked up from the paperwork, the words came simply, "The divorce is granted." That was it. No dramatic moment, just a legal conclusion. The sound of the gavel marked the official end of their marriage. Alexander exhaled slowly. For months, he had lived inside uncertainty. Now, it was finished. The chapter had closed. Bianca gathered her folder calmly. She stood and turned toward the exit. Alexander followed a few steps behind. When they reached the hallway outside the courtroom, he finally spoke. "Bianca." She stopped and turned. "Yes?" Alexander studied her face carefully. "You're handling this better than I expected." Bianca smiled faintly. "People often expect emotional reactions." "Well, this is a big moment," Alexander said. Bianca considered that for a second. "Yes," she said. "It is." Alexander hesitated before continuing. "I hope this doesn't mean we become strangers." Bianca shook her head gently. "Life rarely works that way." Alexander nodded slowly. For a brief moment, the 2 of them stood quietly in the hallway. The silence carried memories neither of them spoke about. The dinners, the conversations, the life they had briefly built together. Then Bianca stepped closer. Her voice remained calm. "I hope everything works out the way you expect." Alexander frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Bianca's smile didn't change. "It means I hope the future you're planning turns out exactly the way you imagine." Alexander studied her expression. Something about the sentence felt unusual, not threatening, not sarcastic, just deliberate. But before he could ask anything else, Bianca picked up her folder. "Well," she said softly, "take care of yourself, Alexander." And with that, she walked down the hallway toward the exit. Alexander watched her leave. Part of him felt relief. The tension between them had ended peacefully. No anger, no hostility, just a clean separation. Later that evening, he met Clara for dinner. The restaurant was quiet, and Clara's excitement was difficult to hide. "So it's official?" she asked. Alexander nodded. "Yes." Clara leaned back in her chair, smiling. "Well," she said, "that's one problem solved." Alexander took a sip of water. "I wouldn't call it a problem." Clara tilted her head. "You know what I mean." Alexander didn't argue. Clara's confidence had grown steadily over the past few weeks. Now that the divorce was finalized, she seemed certain that the future she imagined was already beginning. She spoke about the house again, about preparing the nursery, about the life she planned to build there. Alexander listened quietly. For the first time in months, Everything appeared stable. But as he drove home that night, Bianca's final words returned to his mind. "I hope everything works out the way you expect." The sentence replayed in his thoughts. Something about it felt unfinished, like a statement that carried meaning he hadn't fully understood. He pushed the thought aside. After all, the divorce was done. The future was moving forward, and from his perspective, everything was finally settling into place. What Alexander didn't realize yet was that the foundation beneath his life had already begun shifting, and very soon, the truth Bianca had quietly prepared for would begin revealing itself. For 2 days after the divorce, Alexander felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. The tension that had followed him for months seemed to fade. No more legal meetings, no more uncomfortable conversations, no more uncertainty about how the situation between Bianca and Clara would end. Life, for the first time in a long while, appeared simple again. Clara spent more time at the house. She moved through the rooms comfortably now, speaking openly about plans for the future. One afternoon, she stood in the upstairs hallway, looking into the guest room. "This really would make the perfect nursery," she said thoughtfully. Alexander leaned against the doorway. "I suppose it would." Clara stepped inside, imagining the space differently. "A crib near the wall," she said. "Maybe a rocking chair near the window." Alexander nodded, absent-mindedly. Clara turned toward him. "You're quiet again." Alexander shrugged. "I've just been catching up on work." "Now that everything is settled?" Clara asked. "Yes." Clara smiled. "Well, at least life is finally stabilizing." Alexander believed that too, or at least he wanted to. Later that afternoon, he sat inside his office reviewing emails. The quiet hum of the air conditioning filled the room, while sunlight filtered through the blinds. Most of the messages were routine. Investment updates, property management reports, meeting confirmations. Then his phone rang. Alexander glanced at the screen before answering. "Hello?" The voice on the other end sounded slightly uneasy. "I was reviewing the updated financial filings from the divorce agreement." Alexander leaned back in his chair. "And? There's something you might want to look at." Alexander frowned. "What kind of something?" A short pause followed. "Ownership records." Alexander tapped his pen lightly against the desk. "What about them?" "Well, according to the documentation that was filed yesterday, several assets have been transferred." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "That's normal during a divorce." "Yes," the advisor replied slowly, "but the transfers aren't new." Alexander sat upright. "What do you mean?" "The filings show that some of the properties weren't actually registered under your personal ownership in the first place." Alexander's expression tightened. "That doesn't make sense." The advisor continued carefully. "The mansion, for example." Alexander looked up. "What about it?" "The property records list the registered owner as a corporate entity." Alexander felt a small wave of confusion. "That's standard for tax structures." "Yes," the advisor said, "but the entity listed isn't connected to your business group." Alexander's stomach tightened slightly. "Then whose company is it connected to?" The answer came quietly. "Bianca's." The room went silent. Alexander leaned forward slowly. "Explain that." "The property is registered under a holding company." Alexander's voice lowered. "And that company belongs to Bianca." Alexander stared at the wall in front of him. "That can't be right." The advisor continued speaking. "I thought the same thing at first, so I reviewed several other filings." Alexander didn't respond. His mind had begun racing. "What other filings?" he asked finally. "The investment accounts connected to the development projects." Alexander gripped the edge of the desk. "Those are mine. They appear to be managed through Bianca's financial structure." Alexander felt his pulse rise. "What about the vehicles?" "Same arrangement." Alexander stood up from his chair. "What about the companies?" The advisor hesitated. "That's where things become complicated." Alexander's voice sharpened. "How complicated?" "Several of the real estate partnerships you've been operating through appear to be registered under Bianca's financial group." Alexander ran his hand through his hair. "That's impossible." The advisor spoke carefully. "I believe Bianca structured many of these holdings years ago." Alexander stopped pacing. "Years ago, before the divorce, before the engagement, before the pregnancy." The advisor continued. "The legal structure places primary ownership with Bianca's company." Alexander felt the room grow strangely quiet. "So what are you telling me?" Another pause. Then the truth arrived. Legally speaking, most of the assets connected to your lifestyle belonged to Bianca. Alexander lowered himself slowly back into the chair. The words refused to settle in his mind. The mansion, the investments, the businesses, all of it, connected to Bianca. The advisor continued speaking, but Alexander barely heard the rest. His thoughts had already jumped ahead. Clara upstairs, planning a nursery. Clara, imagining the future inside this house. And Bianca walking away from the courthouse with that calm smile. I hope everything works out the way you expect. For the first time since the divorce, Alexander understood the weight behind those words, because the future he believed he controlled was never actually his, and very soon Clara would discover that truth as well. The house felt unusually quiet that evening. Alexander sat alone in his office for several minutes after the phone call ended. The silence pressed against the walls like a weight. He stared at the documents displayed on his computer screen, reading the same lines again and again, as if repetition might somehow change the meaning. But the information remained the same. Ownership records, corporate filings, property structures, every trail led back to the same place. Bianca. The realization had settled slowly at first. Now it felt unavoidable. Alexander closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands across his face. For years he had believed he was the one directing everything. The deals, the investments, the property acquisitions. But Bianca had always handled the legal frameworks behind those transactions. He had trusted her expertise, never imagining the structure placed her at the center of it all. Footsteps echoed faintly upstairs. Clara was still walking through the house, continuing the plans she had started earlier that afternoon. Alexander could hear her voice occasionally, speaking softly to herself while imagining the future. The nursery, the furniture, the life she believed she had secured. Alexander stood, slowly. There was no avoiding the conversation now. He walked upstairs. Clara stood in the guest room, studying the walls thoughtfully. We could repaint this, she said, without turning around. Alexander remained near the doorway. Clara, we need to talk. She turned toward him. The expression on his face immediately erased the smile from hers. What's wrong? Alexander stepped into the room. The house. Clara frowned slightly. What about it? Alexander hesitated for a moment before continuing. It isn't mine. Clara stared at him. What do you mean? Alexander took a breath. The property records were reviewed today. Clara crossed her arms slowly, and Alexander met her eyes. The house belongs to Bianca. The words hung in the air. Clara blinked once, then laughed softly. That's not funny. I'm not joking. Her smile disappeared. What are you talking about? Alexander ran his hand through his hair. The ownership structure was always under Bianca's company. Clara shook her head. No, that's impossible. Alexander continued speaking, his voice quieter now. The investment accounts, the real estate partnerships, the vehicles. Clara's expression hardened. What about them? They're connected to Bianca's financial structure. Clara stepped backward slightly. You're saying everything here belongs to her? Alexander didn't answer right away. The silence itself became the answer. Clara's voice dropped. What about your money? Alexander looked away. Most of my income was tied to those projects. Clara stared at him, disbelief spreading across her face. So what do you actually own? Alexander swallowed. Very little. The room felt suddenly colder. Clara slowly sat down on the edge of the bed. Her mind tried to process what she had just heard. The mansion, the investments, the cars, the entire life she believed she had stepped back into. None of it belonged to Alexander. Her voice sounded distant when she finally spoke again. You're telling me the life I thought I was coming back to never existed? Alexander didn't answer, because the truth was already clear. Clara lowered her head, one hand resting against her stomach. For months, she had believed the pregnancy secured her future, that it placed her at the center of a powerful life. Now the illusion was collapsing in front of her. You told me you built all of this, she said quietly. Alexander looked toward the window. I believed I did. Clara laughed bitterly. So what happens now? Alexander finally answered. We'll have to leave. Clara looked up slowly. Leave? Alexander nodded. The house belongs to Bianca, and for the first time since this story began, Clara realized something terrifying. She hadn't stolen a wealthy husband. She had stolen a man who had just lost everything. The mansion felt very different that night. Just hours earlier, Clara had walked through the rooms imagining where a nursery would go, where guests would sit during future celebrations, and how her life would unfold inside those walls. Now the house felt strangely unfamiliar, like a place that had never truly belonged to her at all. Clara sat on the edge of the bed upstairs, staring quietly at the floor. Alexander stood near the window, his hands resting against the frame as he looked out toward the quiet Dallas street below. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The silence carried the weight of everything that had just changed. Finally, Clara broke it. "So when do we have to leave?" Alexander didn't turn around. "Soon." "How soon?" He hesitated before answering. "The property records are already finalized." Clara lowered her eyes again. "So the moment Bianca decides she wants the house back?" Alexander nodded slowly. "We'll have to go." Clara exhaled slowly. Not anger, not shouting, just a quiet realization that the life she had imagined had disappeared. She stood and walked slowly through the room. The guest room she had planned to turn into a nursery suddenly felt empty again. The future she had built in her mind no longer had a place here. Downstairs, Alexander began placing a few of his belongings into boxes. Nothing dramatic, just small movements that marked the end of an illusion. Clara joined him later that evening. She watched silently while he packed documents into a case. "You didn't know?" she asked quietly. Alexander looked up. "Know what?" "That everything belonged to Bianca." Alexander shook his head. "No." Clara studied him carefully. "You really believed it was yours?" "Yes." Clara looked around the living room again. The furniture, the artwork, the wide windows overlooking the quiet backyard. All of it suddenly felt temporary. She ran her hand gently over her stomach. The baby growing inside her had not asked for any of this. And suddenly, Clara realized that the life ahead would require something she had never truly practiced before: responsibility. Alexander sealed the final box and stood. "We'll find another place." Clara didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded. The next morning, the house stood quiet again. The driveway empty, the rooms silent. Alexander and Clara had left before noon. No dramatic exit, no arguments. Just two people walking away from a life that had never truly belonged to them. Several hours later, Bianca arrived. The gate opened slowly as her car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out calmly, looking toward the house with a thoughtful expression. The same house she had helped build years earlier. The same house where she had once believed her future with Alexander would grow. Bianca walked inside. The marble floors reflected the afternoon light, just as they always had. The rooms were quiet, empty. She placed her purse on the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment, not smiling, not celebrating, just breathing in the silence. Some people believed victory should feel loud, but Bianca had never been that kind of person. For her, clarity mattered more than triumph. She walked slowly through the living room and out onto the back patio. The warm Dallas air moved gently through the yard. Life in the city continued normally beyond the walls of the property. Cars passed on the street. Distant sounds of traffic drifted through the neighborhood. Bianca leaned against the railing quietly. Her mind moved through the past few years, meeting Alexander, believing in the relationship they had built, discovering the betrayal, choosing patience instead of anger. She had never planned revenge. She had simply protected the life she had built. Her grandmother's voice returned softly in her memory. "People always show you who they are." Bianca smiled faintly. Sometimes they just needed enough time to reveal it. Inside the house, everything remained exactly where it had always been. The structure of Bianca's world had never changed. Only the people inside it had, and now the house belonged once again to the person who had built it from the beginning, quietly, patiently, without ever needing to prove it. Across Dallas, life continued moving the way it always had. Traffic filled the highways during the morning commute. Office buildings opened their doors. Restaurants prepared for another evening of guests who would sit together and talk about work, relationships, and the future. But for three people, the past few weeks had quietly reshaped everything. Clara sat near the window of a small apartment that Alexander had rented temporarily after leaving the mansion. The place was clean, but modest. Nothing like the house she had walked through so confidently only days earlier. No tall ceilings, No marble floors, no wide balconies overlooking the city, just a quiet space with a couch, a small table, and a narrow view of the street outside. Clara rested her hand gently on her stomach. The pregnancy had begun to change the rhythm of her thoughts. For months, she had imagined a life built around luxury, the house, the wealth, the status that came with being connected to Alexander's success. Now those images had disappeared. What remained was something simpler: responsibility. She watched the street below while thinking quietly. For the first time since the story began, Clara wasn't thinking about winning. She was thinking about what kind of life she would build for the child growing inside her. Across the room, Alexander sat at a small desk reviewing several financial documents. His posture looked different now, less confident, more reflective. The phone calls from his advisors had continued over the past few days. Each conversation confirmed the same reality. Without Bianca's financial structure supporting the investments and properties, his personal finances looked very different. Debts, obligations, responsibilities he had never fully examined before. Alexander leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. For years, he had believed success meant being the person everyone recognized, the one who signed deals, the one who attended meetings, the one people assumed was in control. But Bianca had always been the one quietly building the foundation beneath those appearances, and he had never taken the time to understand that. Alexander looked across the room toward Clara. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to argue about, only lessons to absorb. Meanwhile, several miles away, Bianca stood once again on the balcony of the mansion. The evening air carried a gentle warmth as the lights of Dallas slowly began glowing across the skyline. From this height, the city looked calm, peaceful. Bianca rested her arms lightly against the railing, watching the horizon quietly. Her life had returned to something familiar: work during the day, evenings filled with reflection. The same house she had built her stability around years earlier. Some people might have expected her to feel victorious, but victory wasn't the word that came to her mind. What she felt instead was clarity. Life had simply revealed the truth, and truth always had a way of appearing eventually. Bianca thought about Alexander for a moment, a man who had confused visibility with ownership, a man who believed success meant standing in the spotlight, and Clara, a woman who believed security could be taken from someone else. Neither of them were villains in Bianca's mind, just people who had made decisions without fully understanding the structure of the world they were stepping into. Bianca had learned something different growing up in South Dallas. You don't protect your life through anger. You protect it through wisdom, through patience, through paying attention to the details most people ignore. The same lesson her grandmother had taught her years earlier returned to her thoughts again. People always show you who they are. You just have to watch long enough to see it. The city lights flickered softly in the distance as the night deepened. Bianca stood there for several minutes, letting the quiet settle around her, because in the end, the real victory had never been about the house, or the money, or even the relationship that had ended. The real victory was something much deeper: self-respect, the ability to walk away from betrayal without losing your sense of who you are, the discipline to protect the life you built with your own hands, and the patience to let truth reveal itself without forcing it. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is not the one who fights the hardest. Sometimes it is the one who waits, and when the moment finally arrives, simply lets reality speak for itself. If this story made you think about the choices people make in relationships, take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear this message. And if you believe patience and self-respect are the true forms of power, let me know in the comments. Welcome to Mr. Kingswell Stories, where powerful life lessons are shared through unforgettable storytelling. Before you go, tell me one thing in the comments. What city and time are you watching this story from? Because no matter where you are in the world tonight, there is always another story waiting to be told.